The cross or crucifix is such a central figure in our churches, in our homes and in our faith. In this series, I'm going to be looking at 6 examples of the cross, of the crucifix, throughout the history of art, and seeing what they can tell us about our journey of faith as a church, about what the cross can say to us today, and about how these representations have changed over the years. Welcome to 6 Crosses. Hello and welcome to the second of our explorations of the crucifixion in art throughout history. If you watched last week's programme, you'll remember that we were looking at a very unusual image from around about the year 200. Well, today we're going to jump forward in time almost 1,000 years. Now, that seems like an awfully long period of time, and you might be asking yourself, what am I skipping? What am I missing out? Well, the truth is, there wasn't that much. There wasn't that much in the development of the cross in art for that period of 1,000 years. Some things did happen. There was a big thing happened in the 4th century, and that was the Roman Emperor Constantine I. If you remember, we've talked in the past about the periods of persecution of the Christian church. Well, in the year 313, that all changed because the Emperor Constantine, without becoming a Christian himself, actually issued an edict of toleration of Christianity throughout the whole of the Roman Empire. The Edict of Milan is one of those great turning points in the history of the church because it ushered in so many things. Until that point, Christians had not really been able to build very visible churches. They'd worshipped in homes and houses and other buildings that were adapted for the purpose. But after 313, they could suddenly start building public places of worship. Bishops became noticeable and important figures. The church, as it were, came out of the hiding and took its place within the structure of the Roman Empire. So 313 marks a huge change in the way the church worked and also, therefore, in the way the church used art. Because now, as I said, we could have church buildings, and those church buildings would have to be somehow decorated. There was another big thing that happened around about the same time that's particularly relevant to what we're looking at, and that was the Emperor Constantine's mother, Saint Helena. She went on pilgrimage to the Holy Land, to the places associated with her Christian faith, and she there, it said, discovered the relic of the true cross of Jesus in Jerusalem. And that introduced a whole new interest in the cross of Jesus. Veneration for the cross begins at that point. The familiar rituals that we have on Good Friday come exactly from that discovery of the cross. And it seems as though that brings a different understanding of the cross throughout Christian art after that. So 313, the beginning of the 4th century, that's a major turning point. In terms of how the cross or the crucifixion are depicted thereafter for that 1,000 years that we're skipping across, there still aren't actually that many things to look at. In a sense, it follows 2 paths which are distinct. The path of representing the crucifixion, in other words, the cross with the body of Christ visible, especially at the moment of his death, and the idea of just depicting the cross without the body of the Lord. The first of those 2 paths has got very few examples. There are some pretty good ones, if they are a little bit unusual. There's another one in Rome, at the Church of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. It's an amazing church. There are some absolutely phenomenal churches in Rome. I could go on for hours and hours and hours about them. Santa Sabina is one of my favourites. It's actually up on the Aventine Hill, and for 3 years when I was doing my degree I used to walk past it every day on my way to and from lectures. Now, the Church of Santa Sabina was built in the year 432, so about 100 years after Constantine's declaration. And that building still retains much of its original form. The thing that we're looking at, though, are the doors to the church, because those wooden doors, amongst the oldest carved wooden doors in the world, also feature the earliest public representation of the crucifixion of Jesus. It's in a little panel which is up on the top left of the door, which in itself is a rather odd place to put a depiction of the crucifixion. We would think that because of our traditions and what we're used to, that would actually have to be right slap bang in the centre. But no, it's tucked away up in a corner. And it is very odd. At first glance, you almost might think it isn't a crucifixion until you look closer and you see that those three figures are actually nailed to crosses. Jesus in the centre and the two thieves crucified with him, as we hear in the Gospel account. So that dates from the 5th century. For the next depiction, we have to scroll almost more than 100 years to the year 586. And we move from Rome to Syria to a little book known as the Rabbula Gospels. Rabbula was the name of the scribe, the artist who actually wrote the things out. And the Rabbula Gospels actually have a series of, we might almost call them simplistic illustrations. But one of them is important because it shows the crucifixion. And again, it shows the scene that we saw at Santa Sabina, Jesus with the two thieves, very prominent, actually portraying the story as we hear it in the Gospel. Well, as I say, this again is very rare. And apart from these two examples, we find nothing until we move north into the Holy Roman Empire in the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries. There we see great gilded crosses being made for Roman emperors, and they figure the crucifixion. There's one called the Cross of Otto and Matilda, where you can see the actual figure of Christ on the cross very clearly. And there's another one called the Lothar Cross, or the Cross of Lothar II, which is today kept in Aachen, another amazing city to visit if you ever get a chance. And while on the front of it there is no figure, on the back of this cross you can just about see faintly etched the actual figure of Jesus at the moment of his death. But very much that's it in terms of representations of the crucifixion. If we're talking about representations of the cross, well, it's a different story because we have a lot more evidence, this second path. The cross, without the figure of Jesus, from the 4th century onwards, features quite often. We see it in Mosaic art, we see it in frescoes, we see it carved in stone. One of the earliest examples is a very, very beautiful carved stone sarcophagus, a stone coffin, that was found in Rome in the catacombs of St. Domitilla and that now lives in the Vatican museums. You can see as a beautiful series of images representing the passion of Jesus. We see Jesus before Pilate, we see Jesus carrying the cross, we see the crowning with thorns. But at the very centre of the sarcophagus, where you might expect to find a representation of the crucifixion, we don't. We have this rather strange image, which actually is depicting the resurrection. Yes, there is a cross, a very recognisable cross, but it's empty. And above the cross, we see a laurel wreath, a symbol of victory. And in the centre of that famous symbol, the chrismon or the labarum, with the chi and the rho, the two first letters in Greek of the word Christos, of Christ. At the bottom of the cross are two soldiers, but they're not the soldiers executing Jesus. These are the soldiers asleep at the tomb as he rises. So here we do see the cross, but not at the moment of Jesus' death. Here, in a sense, the empty cross stands there as a sign of the victory of the resurrection. Now, this sarcophagus has been dated to the year 350, so very soon after those changes that Constantine actually brought about. Some say that that image, the chi rho image, what looks like an X and a P, that was a vision seen by Constantine the night before his decisive victory over his enemy Maxentius, which gave him the Roman Empire and which prompted him to allow the toleration of Christianity. But that image keeps cropping up as well, that and the cross without the figure. There's another example from very early on at the Church of St. John Lateran, the Pope's Cathedral in Rome. That was built very, very early after Constantine's decree, and it features an amazing mosaic in the apse. Now, this mosaic isn't all original from the 4th century. It's been added to over the years. That's why we see various saints and popes and other figures who lived a long time after the basilica was first built. But it's thought that the central section of this apse mosaic dates back to the beginnings of the basilica, the 4th or latest, the 5th century. And what do we see there? Again, we see an empty cross. But this cross is a little bit more than just empty. It's a jewelled cross. There's a Latin name for this, the crux gemmata. And this is a constant feature in Christian art from now on. The cross bedecked with jewels, not with the body of the Lord. This example from St John Lateran is very interesting for the one that we're coming to at the end, in that it shows the cross on a hill. And on that hill there are 4 rivers. And below that there are animals. There is nature and wildlife. It's thought that that hill and those 4 rivers are a reference to the Garden of Eden. So the jewelled cross of Jesus stands in the Garden of Eden. As Adam reached out to the tree for an evil purpose, to eat of the apple, so Jesus, the new Adam, is fixed to the new tree, the tree of life, for a good purpose, to bring us salvation. So the mosaic in John Lateran is really significant. And that idea of the jewelled cross, the triumphant cross, is one that we keep seeing. There's another beautiful example outside Rome, down in Naples, in the very ancient baptistry of San Giovanni in Fonte, where there's a dome, and at the top of that dome, again, we see a version of this Chi Rho image, or a cross with what looks like a P coming off it. But this is the X and the P, the Chi and the Rho that form the first 2 letters of the word Christos. This dates from around about the year 400. Coming back to Rome, there is another amazing church, Santa Padenciana, with one of the oldest original mosaics. You can tell that because the style looks so different from the very formalised style of later mosaics. This one was probably done at the end of the 4th century, 385, 390. And it shows Jesus seated with his apostles, but behind him, again, on a hill, there is this jewelled cross. There's some beautiful examples up in Ravenna as well. A little bit later on, 6th century, around about the year 550, the Church of San Apollinare in Classe. Again, the Apse mosaic, a beautiful gold cross, simply standing on a blue field bedecked with stars. There's nothing of the horror of the death of Jesus, the passion here. This is just the glory of the cross. Coming back to Rome for one more time, we also see this in another amazing church that not many people visit, San Stefano Rotondo. And in the 7th century, they built a little chapel for the relics of 2 martyrs, St Primus and St Felicianus. And again, on the apse of that little chapel, they depicted just a very simple gold cross. But that's it. That's all we see for hundreds of years. That is how Christians used the cross. Very few examples of the crucifixion, a lot more examples of the crux gemmata, the jewelled cross, the sign of victory. It's not until we get to that 1,000 years later that we actually see the two coming together. If you like, the jewelled cross and the crucifixion of Jesus, they come together. And what the best example and earliest example of that is the cross that we're focusing on today. The amazing cross in the Apse mosaic of the Church of San Clemente in Rome. The Church of San Clemente is an absolutely amazing building. If you ever do get the opportunity to visit Rome, you must include a visit to San Clemente. It's wonderful for so many reasons. One of the biggest ones is the way in which it illustrates archaeology so clearly, because San Clemente is not just one building, but several buildings, all stacked one on top of the other. This is how archaeology works. Archaeology works in layers. It's almost like a cake. And the idea is that each layer represents a different period in history. And so the deeper you go, the further back in time you're going. It's like a lift with, say, 21 buttons. We come into the lift on the 21st floor. That's where we are now, the 21st century. But if we were to go down and press the buttons and go down, say, to floor number 4, that would take us down. And as we go down, we're going to the past till we arrive at the 4th century. That's not that fanciful, because that's exactly what you find at the Church of San Clemente. You start off at street level in the 21st century, and then you have to go down a bit to go into the present church, which dates from the 12th century. From there, you go down a flight of steps into another church underneath it, which dates from the 4th century. And there you can go down yet another flight of steps below that church to Roman buildings, a warehouse and a house, a private house, dating from the 1st century. Each of these were built one on top of the other. As I say, this is how archaeology works. In rural areas, the layers are quite thin, but in cities, because of the amount of rubbish that we humans produce, this happens very quickly. It's said that at the time when the 12th century church of San Clemente was built, the front door was already several feet down below the street level because the streets had raised in height over the centuries. So San Clemente is a fantastic example of how archaeology works, of how we use these layers to understand the dates and the relative timings of events. We're not going to be going down to the 4th century or the 1st century levels because we're staying up in the 12th century church, which is absolutely amazing. It was built around about the year 1130, possibly. We're not entirely sure. Rome had suffered quite a few disasters in the previous decades. There'd been a Norman conquest of Rome. You know, we know 1066 and all that, when the Normans invaded us. Well, the Normans were quite busy. In the year 1084, they actually sacked and invaded the city of Rome and caused quite a bit of damage. But there'd also been earthquakes and floods and all sorts of other things going on. And so they needed to rebuild the church. Rather than knocking down the old one, because remember what I said about the floor level being so much lower, they just filled it in and used it as the foundations for the church that we go into today. When you go into San Clemente, you cannot miss the glory of that church, which is this amazing mosaic behind the high altar. Now, this all dates from 1130, thereabouts. One artist, or one group of artists, created this amazing picture. It is a crucifixion, but you might have to look for that because the actual cross is rather small in terms of the whole composition of the work. It's there, right in the centre, that little dark spot. And you can see on the cross, but completely out of proportion, is a figure of the body of the Lord in the moment of his death. And either side are those two figures that we will keep seeing with the cross: Our Lady, the Lord's Mother, and St. John, the beloved disciple. In the Gospel we hear of how Jesus entrusted them to each other from the cross, and they are constant figures by the side of the cross when it's depicted in this way. In a sense, though, that little scene in the middle of this mosaic is almost lost with the riot of activity that's going on around it. And this is why I find this so beautiful. It is such a joyful image. That moment of death is not the dominant feature of this mosaic, of this apse. The dominant feature is life, is nature, is vitality, is vibrancy. Let me just describe what we're seeing. At the foot of that cross, which is itself brightened by those 12 doves, probably representing the 12 apostles, or possibly the 12 tribes of Israel, or possibly 12 months of the year, who knows? Remember, 12 is one of those mystical, symbolic numbers that can have lots and lots of meanings. But below that, the cross seems to be coming out of this amazing plant, this Acanthus plant. And the Acanthus is very common in Rome. It's the plant that was often used by the ancient Romans to decorate columns. Corinthian columns are made of curved acanthus leaves, and it features a lot in their mosaics and things like that. That Acanthus plant is resting on a hill, and from that hill there are 4 rivers flowing. Deer are coming and drinking from those waters. From the Acanthus plant we see these shoots springing out that take over the whole mosaic, and they actually end in 50 spandrels. Now, I've said that the plant is an acanthus. The tendrils are probably a vine, so we've got two things going on there. But this amazing vine, with its 50 circular spandrels, covers the whole of the rest of the apse. And in each of those spandrels, there's something depicted. It might be a cup or a vessel, or a bird, or a person. And throughout the whole mosaic, we see these amazing images of ordinary rural life, of nature, and of ordinary human beings at work in the fields, looking after their sheep, looking after their land. We see other figures as well. We see doctors of the church, monk-like figures, again caught in the twisting spirals of this vine, perched almost comically on this amazing tree. The whole thing is a riot of colour, of life, of vivacity. But in a sense, as you follow these twisting vines and see each of the little focuses in each of these 50 focal points, your eyes still always led back to the cross, to that still moment at the centre of this apse, where Jesus has died on the cross and is mourned by Mary and John, the beloved disciple. So what's going on here? Well, this is not a rare representation. The idea of a mosaic showing the tree of life, of the Garden of Eden, of paradise is very common. Remember, we saw the mosaic from St. John Lateran, the central part of it, which perhaps dates all the way back to the 4th or 5th century, again showing the hill of the Garden of Eden, the hill of paradise, with the 4 rivers flowing from it and the deer drinking from those rivers. Again at St. John Lateran, there are scenes of nature and human activity at the foot of that hill. In San Clemente, it's made more explicit. The cross of Jesus, the moment of his death, is now seen as the opening of the way to the new paradise. And we, in a sense, can already share in that life. As we live our ordinary human lives as part of the church, we're already, as it were, foretasting that paradise garden, that new Eden that the death of Jesus on the cross has won for us. There is an inscription on the San Clemente mosaic which actually tells us what this vine is meant to represent. It is the church. And that's why it embraces all aspects of human life. The monks at their studies, the farmers in their fields, the birds of the air, all of nature, all brought together in the family of the church, united in that moment of the death of Jesus on the cross, which puts an end to the punishment, the expulsion from Eden that we read about in Genesis, and opens the door to the new paradise in Jesus himself. So this Apse mosaic is an amazing statement about the death of Jesus that we've not seen in art before. Remember those earlier examples of the crucifixion? They were just depicting what the gospel tells us, Jesus crucified between 2 thieves. Whereas this mosaic is going much, much deeper. It's not just representing the scene. It's preaching a sermon. It's handing on a message. It's saying so much more. It's saying that the whole of creation is caught up in the redemptive act of Jesus on the cross. All the birds and beasts, all the human beings, whatever their occupation, whatever their status in life, all of them can be caught up in this vine, which is the church, the body of Christ that flows from the cross, from that moment of his sacrifice. As we think about Pope Francis's call for us in Laudato Si to think about the care for creation, this Apse mosaic is an incredibly fitting image. The way in which the whole of creation is brought into this vision of what the church is, the way in which the birds of heaven are resting in the vine which is the church. Nature is being protected by the church. That's what we should be doing. We should be living out this mosaic, this image. The cross of Jesus and his sacrifice, which brings hope to the whole world, this should inspire us to care for nature, to make sure that these images that we see of men and women, of birds and beasts, of plants and fields, of the whole of creation, as it were, united by the cross, this is where we must put our work. We must care for creation. We must make the message of this Apse a reality, so that all creation is brought together in the cross of Jesus. Thinking about this reminds me of something else very strange, which is where I'll end. On Good Friday, every year for quite a long time now, I always try, if I can, make time to listen to one of my favourite operas, Parsifal by Wagner. Now, it's not the shortest of operas, it's not the lightest of operas, this ain't no Verdi or Puccini, What Parsifal does is it talks about all sorts of legends that we would call Arthurian legends about the Holy Grail. And the last act of Parsifal is set on Good Friday. I'm not going to go into the whole story of it. If you know it, you know it. If you don't know it, it's not that important. But on Good Friday, the hero actually brings back the Lance of Longinus that he's rediscovered to the Grail Knights who keep the Holy Grail in order to bring healing. And the whole story can be wrapped up in redemption and grace. But as he arrives back, he meets an old knight, Gornemantz, and he's surprised to hear that it's Good Friday. And Gornemantz tells him that Good Friday is a joyous day. And Parsifal is puzzled. He said, hang on a minute, how is he joyful? This is the day when Jesus died on the cross. But Gornemantz replied, yes, but that's the point. The death of Jesus changed the whole world, the whole of creation. That's why the flowers are appearing in the fields on Good Friday. That's why it is good. That's why it is a joyful day, because that moment of death has brought redemption to everything. The whole of nature rejoices at the Saviour's sacrifice. I'll put a link to a recording of the Good Friday music from Parsifal that, if anyone's interested, you can actually watch that. But perhaps have another look at this amazing mosaic in San Clemente. This vision, this green and beautiful and vibrant vision of the whole of creation caught up in the cross, the tree of life, the tree of everyone's life. And let's think about how we can fulfill the gift of salvation to all creation by our care for each other and for the world entrusted to us. Thanks for watching today. Next week we are moving north. We're heading up to Germany to a very, very different representation of the cross. One that some people might find a bit off-putting, and yet speaks very profoundly of the compassion of Jesus for all who suffer. Thanks for watching. See you again soon.